lecture series established by our longtime glorious leader, Dr. Caroline Brettell. Thank you very much. It is especially a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Britt Bousman, Professor of Anthropology and Honorary Professor of International Studies at Texas State University. And in fact, this is a welcome back. Britt is a product of our department. He got a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD, and because he's an underachiever, he went over to the University of Cambridge and got a BA and an MA there as well. Just as his education is bicontinental, so too is his research. Britt has made important contributions to our understanding of the Stone Age of Africa, particularly Southern Africa, as well as, and much closer to home, the archaeology of Texas and the Southern Plains. What ties his research interests together is the broader goal of understanding how humans adapt to different environmental and climatic challenges, particularly as these change over time. Britt is an accomplished scholar, has published extensively on topics from Africa's Middle Stone Age to its extinct fauna to processes of domestic pastoralism. He's also, of course, published on North America's earliest humans, post-glacial adaptive strategies, and the archaeology of the late prehistoric and historic eras. Today's lecture in the Brettell series is in memory of two of our longtime colleagues in archaeology here at SMU, Tony Marks and Garth Sampson, both of whom passed away just in the last year or so and are much missed. And it's fitting that Britt is here today because he was a student of Garth's and later a close colleague and longtime collaborator. Please join me in welcoming back to SMU Dr. Britt Bousman, speaking on the topic of Conquistadors, Bison hunters, and horses in the Southern Plains. Britt Bousman.
It's been fun being back. We've never in this room, I don't think, but still. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the recent past in the Southern Plains. But first I'm going to kind of retrace a bit here and just say a few words about Garth Sampson and his wife Bee. So I first met Garth in late August of 1972. And I took the first class he ever taught. It was, I think, Old World Prehistory. It started at 9 o'clock in the morning, so I'm pretty sure he didn't teach one before that. That was his first semester. And he started out, and here was this guy that had what I thought was a British accent. Found out later it wasn't. And he went in both barrels. He was lecturing very quickly, writing on the board, drawing artifacts, drawing maps. And within the first hour, I realized that there was no way I could keep up with this guy. And so after that class, I went up to him and I said, would you mind if I taped your lectures? There's a new invention out called a tape recorder. And it has cassettes in it, and I think I can do that without disrupting the class. And Garth, if you knew Garth, if you said something that he wasn't really sure about, he would always look at you over his glasses for a while and just study you to see if you were bullshitting him. I wasn't quite sure. And he eventually said, yeah, that would be fun. And I did it. And every night I'd go back home and transcribe these. And then the next day, he'd always have a summary. And if his summary didn't match, then I'd correct him in class, which he was always very generous in accepting. But since I almost memorized his lecture from the day before, he really couldn't contest me. And I remember one time I said, I can play the tape for you if you want to hear it. Anyway, but I did my dissertation under Garth. We worked with Garth in the field for many, many months. I spent over 19 months working with him on the Seacow River Valley survey. Went back and spent close to a year doing my own dissertation research. And then we collaborated in many cases over the years, and we became close friends. And I became a friend of his family. And I'm going to tell a story on him if I can, going back. But when he was starting his first degree, which is at the University of Cape Town, the person who was teaching this class was a guy by the name of John Goodwin. And John Goodwin had died just a few weeks before they were supposed to start. So they were rushing around trying to find somebody to cover his classes, and they brought in Ray Inskeep. And the deal they made with Inskeep is he'd only have to teach the second-year classes. He wouldn't have to teach the first-year classes. And Garth came in, and he was a new student. He needed the first-year classes, or at least they thought he did. And he told them that he should place out of that because he'd already written a book on archaeology, and he didn't need that preliminary stuff. And he was willing to show them the manuscript that he had in hand, and that they should just forego the first year for him. Obviously, they didn't let him get away with it, but he took his degree backwards. He took the second year first and the first year second. So, anyway, if you do Garth, you understand the cheek it took that he had to do this. But anyway, he retired in 2013. After he retired from SMU, he came to us in San Marcos and was there until 2013. And then he moved back to restore his house. And I don't know if you can see, but this is his house here. It's the first house on the shore. And you walk out on this stoop in the morning, and you look across False Bay. It's about 40 miles across, and you see this beautiful case. And in the far distance in False Bay, let's see if I can do this without tripping myself. I can't. I'm going to go around there. On the far distance in False Bay, this is a location of the Schuling site that he reported on one of his first publications when he was an undergraduate. So he was a precocious guy. But one of the things that nobody in this room has seen is a photograph of Garth as he was getting ready to go to Cambridge. Before he had a beard. I never saw him without a beard. And I don't know if you can see that here. So his nephew sent this to me yesterday, and I brought it in. So I made him go through the old family photographs and stuff. Anyway, he did a BA at Cambridge and he did his PhD at Oxford, so he was pretty well educated. The other thing I want to say is when I came here, there was a group of people that were teaching here, and Tony Marks, who's in the middle photograph here, second from the left, was here. He was hired probably when he was in his 20s, would be my guess. And standing next to him is Joel Shiner, and then obviously Fred Wingard, but also Ed Fry and Ben Wallace, and of course Ron Webbington. So I took classes from all these guys, and it was really a great education. It gave me a huge foundation that has lasted all these years. And they all made contributions in their own ways. And, over a beer, I'll tell you stories about all these people, but we don't have enough time today here. But you know, this is I think a representation of the people that helped form this department and created this department, and y'all are benefiting from the work and the contributions these guys made. Okay, let's see. Okay, so the title is Conquistadors, Bison, Hunters, and Horses in the Seven Plains. This is an ongoing project. This is not, we're kind of in the middle of it. If I'm lucky. And I'm working with one of my graduate students, Byron Allen, and we're working together. We're also collaborating with some of the folks in this department on this work as well, and hopefully more. And so this is kind of a status report rather than any kind of a final report. But when I was an undergraduate and I was working in the contract program with Alan Skinner, where's Alan there? He hired me, you know, probably when I was too inexperienced and too young, but I got a lot out of it. One of the things that I read were some of the early Spanish explorer records in the Southern Plains, and I'd always been interested in them. I'm originally from Abilene, so you know I'm a product of the plains, and this is an area that I had interest in all my life. And I will say that when I got to my hotel room last night, and this was on the TV screen, I thought, how appropriate. I sent this to Myra Allen last night as a little clip, and her response was, "How did they know what you were talking about?" I didn't tell her that it's a mascot from SMU. I'll let that one go for a while here. I'll tell her eventually. But anyway, I thought it was an appropriate way of starting out this whole trip. Anyway, if we look at the imagery of Native Americans in North America, overwhelmingly they're shown as Plains Indians. And this is just a first page in a Google search, and about more than half of these are Plains Indian representations. And in paintings and in sculpture, Plains Indians get represented time and time again. It's not an accurate representation for the whole population of North America, but it's the popular representation. TV shows, you you have this again, they're always represented, even if the actors are not Native American actors. He was Italian descent, but Native American to the TV producers. And back in the day when TVs used to sign off, we had these test bags here. On the top was a Native American in a war bonnet, and you used to see that, if you stayed up late enough, your parents would let you stay up late enough, you could see that at like 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night. And even in Hollywood movies, the Plains Indians get overrepresented. And yes, now they're actually Native Americans who are the actors, they're in co-equal roles, they're in the right locations, they're even using Native American languages, so it's more accurate. But it doesn't matter what language you're speaking in, all over the world, people think of Native Americans as plain Indians. I was telling some folks earlier, some of the graduate students, that in 1976 I was doing a survey in Lesotho, in the most isolated place I'd ever been in my life. No roads, no electricity, no running water, anything. And I had a conversation with one of the headmen, and he asked me where I was from, and I said, Texas. And he said, oh, cowboys and Indians. How the hell did you know that? So this representation is really pervasive, but the question is how did this start? What was the origin of this thing? And what do we know about this? And actually, it's damn little, to be surprising. So when we started this project, and it's been kind of slowly going on for a number of years now, the questions we were asking ourselves is, when did horses first reach Native American groups in the plains? Who were the indigenous groups that acquired horses? Because the bison hunters were on horses, effectively. How did Native American groups acquire the horses? Who did they get the horses from? And where did those horses come from originally? Okay, obviously, at that time, indigenous Native American horses had gone extinct quite a long time before then. David Meltzer can talk to you all about that in some detail here. And the question is how did this happen? A lot of historians early on, and even anthropologists in some degrees, believe that the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 was a major event where horses were released out to the plains, and you got the development of plains Indian horse cultures. That's not correct. We know that there were horses much before that. So the question is how did this happen? There's been a recent study by William Taylor out of Boulder that's looked at this, and what they're doing is they're doing direct dating on horse bones, which is the way to go. We don't have that yet. We're working toward that. And in his article, he talks about 4 sites that have early dates dating to the 17th century. One of these sites is in the southwest, and it's down here. The others are in the plains, or actually in the Rocky Mountains and beyond. And if you look at this evidence, it's interesting. This is out of his article. This is just his calibrated radiocarbon dates. And I don't know if you're familiar with how this works, but age is at the bottom. And then these are probability functions here. So they tell you the likelihood of the dates being in those age ranges. And what you can see here is that they all are likely to have happened before the Pueblo Revolt. Well, that's something that everyone, I think, is fairly comfortable with. But the question is when before the Pueblo Revolt? And this is another one of his figures. His estimate for when horses were probably introduced in the Southern Plains, using Cortez's arrival in Mexico in 1519 as a starting point, his estimate for the plains is 1544. But if you look at the documentary evidence, Coronado, the first Spanish explorer, right there in the 1540s, 1541 to be exact, and so that's the idea that you're saying it could have been as early as 1519 is just not very accurate in our opinion here. So we've looked at this again. One of the things we were looking at the general location shown in the red arrows of where the early Spanish explorers went. They did go all the way into central Kansas. They went down to the Southern Plains, obviously in the southwest. We're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. But his sites, one of the sites that's in the southwest part of Pueblo is in the right area. But these sites are way the heck out of that area, a long way away. And the horses just likely wouldn't have wandered that far on their own. We recalibrated and looked at the sites we're using here. In this case, we're using Coronado's entry date to the southwest as the beginning age. And you can see one of the likely time periods here for Ponte Pueblo is before that. That can't happen. there weren't horses in the Southwest before Coronado got there. He had a lot of horses, as we'll see, but no one before he came. So that can be ignored. And then what we start to see is dates really in the possibly late 1500s, early 1600s, early middle 1600s. But even that can be debated. And we think from various evidence that I'll talk about that some of these time frames are unlikely to have happened here. We've recalibrated this, and what we see is that using the Coronado imagery is that the entrance probably was much later, and actually I think it was closer to this period here, and that all of the central mean ages of those dates are in the 17th century and later, which is not surprising, at all. If you look at the evidence that Taylor had, this is the single horse bone from American Falls. American Falls is in the Snake River Plain in southern Idaho. It was found on the shore of the lake. It's not from an archaeological excavation at all. It's a paleontological specimen. And if you look at this model age that he got was 1639. If you look at the remains from Black's Fork, this is the one in southwestern Wyoming. It was from an archaeological excavation. Okay, it's well excavated and clearly indicated. This horse, which was butchered, and there are lots of cut marks and chop marks made with metal tools on this specimen. And in fact, this diagram here shows all the places where there were cut marks and chop marks here. It was butchered intensively. It was also buried, I don't know if you can see this, it seems light, too light here. It was also buried with 3 coyote skulls. And I think all of this evidence suggests that these earlier dates are unlikely. This probably, in my opinion, dates to the latter period, which would be the late 1700s. In the early 1600s, there weren't metal tools in that far north in the plains. They just hadn't gotten there yet. It's just not feasible. So even though the probability is lower for that more recent date, I think the likelihood, based on the archaeological evidence, makes it much more likely here. The specimen from Kaw River in Kansas, again, is not an archaeological specimen. It was found in a sandbar in 1910. No evidence whatsoever about the context. And there's a mandible and a skull. There's debate about whether the mandible and the skull are from the same animal or not. The mandible had evidence identified by Scott, one of the original people that looked at this recently, identified that there was metal bridle damage on the mandible itself, and I'm not contesting that. But again, I'm wondering about the age. And so this age here in the 1500s is completely unlikely and impossible. If it occurs during this time frame, 1632 to 1670, it's probably at the very end of that time range, which would not be impossible. But there's also a possibility that it's dates to the 1700s. Again, they're almost, I don't know of any sites that have metal on them with metal bridle parts on them that date to the mid-1600s. So again, I think these dates are questionable. One of the problems that they have is that some of these specimens only have one radiocarbon date run on them, and you need a sample of radiocarbon dates to have any kind of reliability. A single date could be right, but it could also not be totally accurate. And so we hope to see that evidence replicated by further research. Okay, so just in summary, the evidence in the southwest of Paco, I think, provides strong support that there were domestic animals there. We know that from the historic records. They were attacking the Spanish and killing horses. This doesn't mean that they were riding them by any stretch. There was also sheep recovered from Coronado's campsite at Santiago Pueblo, excavated by Brad Vieira, who clearly, so the stock were getting loose and being slaughtered and eaten probably. But in the central and northern plains, all of those specimens are questionable, and they need further verification to be accepted, I think, with any kind of degree of reliance. So now we're in a situation where we say, okay, when did horses get into the plains? And what's the most likely avenue that this happened? So if you look at the early Spanish explorer trails that have been reconstructed by historians and stuff, And this nifty map here, you can see it has a lot of those under, actually comes from a research unit out of Poland. But the Europeans are just as interested in North American Indians as we are. And there are museums that are established for North American Indians and a lot of plains stuff in Europe as well. And so this is actually one of the better maps I could find. And what we see here, the sequence is that the first person to get to the southwest was Fray Marcos de Niza in 1539. He was followed very quickly by Coronado, 1540 to 42, and then a whole series of other folks coming into the plains here. But the point to be made here is that this is the American Southwest, here's the plains, here's Kansas. They weren't going up that way. There's no direct movement of Spanish people up into that area. So the Spanish didn't take those specimens up there if they actually date to that early period. And that, again, makes that interpretation more questionable, I think. If we look in the southern plains, it's a different kind of setting here. And I've done a fair amount of work down in this area. And if we look at the archaeological groups that are here, you have what's identified as Tiro. Is that long? I guess it is. I didn't use it. The Tirolaga groups here, identified by Jack Hughes. Garza complex here. And then also down here is the Silo complex that Bob Wood and other people have been looking at here. And there are some Brettell sites here. One of the things that I showed these red dots are sites where there are horses that have been found. I included Mustang Springs. I realize that's not Garza complex, but I included it because there are horses and they're dated, which is... You do have it in there? Okay. Well, then we'll include them. The dates are quite recent, so I don't think the horses dated are that old. But what you can see here is that there are horses coming off of prehistoric archaeological sites. Two sites have been excavated in some detail, and that's the Longhorn site here on Lubbock Lake as well. And those are probably our best contacts for horses, as we'll see here in a second. So if you look at Lubbock Lake, the upper left photograph shows where the anatomical position for the horse remains that Eileen Johnson's have found in her excavations. She's done long-term excavations at this site. I think she started digging in 1972 or so. And a lot of her work is focused on the Paleo-Indian stuff, but that's not the most interesting stuff. The interesting stuff is this. Sorry, I had to get a dig in there. The image on the right, this is a general excavation shot, just shows you how carefully they've excavated this site. It's really a remarkable bit of work. The area that we're interested in is Area 13B, which has proto-historic occupations. There are three horse elements that have been found in this. Is a photograph of one. They're really well preserved. She's working on this as we speak. And if we look at the radiocarbon dates, and there are a lot of radiocarbon dates. These are old beta decay dates, which is all we have at this stage of the game. I think she's going to run more. But if you look at this, and you use modern calibration methods to look at this, what I'm interested in is when did that deposit cease to accumulate? Okay, because the bones are in that deposit. I'm not looking at when it starts, but when did it cease to accumulate? And there are two approaches that I've used. One is just to look at the different layers as phases and to estimate the phase boundaries. And the other way is to use stratigraphic constrained calibration, looking at the position of the radiocarbon dates within the stratigraphy. Two separate kinds of ways of looking at it, but they tell us fairly similar information. So with the phase model here, what we can see is that at least, most likely, at least by 1657, that deposit had ceased to accumulate. Probably earlier than that, but at least by then. In the depositional model, the estimate we get is 1655. And that's at the top. The bones, and I don't have the exact position of the bones here, but they're somewhere in the middle here. So they're probably older than that date. Okay, we're working on a paper with Eileen, and we're going to get that information and add to it. But what this gives us an indication is by the mid-1600s, that material has been there, it's in place, it's been excavated extremely carefully and well, and there's no question about whether what that dates to. Direct dates on the bone, which she's contemplating right now, is going to give us a lot more detailed information, more accurate information. She needs to do multiple samples, so we actually have a sample of dates, not a single date. Single dates can be wonky, and you can't just trust a single date usually. That's one of the weaknesses of Taylor's work, in my opinion. And then we look at different estimates, and these are just cumulative probability estimates for when that end period might have been. But when it starts to flatten out here, you pretty much say that's likely that it was, the deposition was over by that stage. Anyway, these are just statistical gains that again show us the likelihood of this. This pattern with the phase model suggested it could have ended as early as 1640. I think it was actually probably a little bit before that, but we've got to do more analysis to be sure. The other set of sites we're going to look at is a Longhorn and Headstream site. This was excavated as a contract project in the early 1990s. The field archaeologist was a guy by the name of Doug Boyd. Elton Pruitt and I were the PIs on this project and spent a lot of time out there with the crew. And we have two sites here. We have the Headstream, these are photo stories of the Headstream sites, mainly in these woods. And then on that opposite bank is a Longhorn site. And these are some of the best preserved sites. Unfortunately, this was part of the lake project. You can see in the distance, that valley is the Double Mountain Fork of the Brazos River. And what you're looking at there is the dam axis. And this is underwater, and it's been underwater ever since they built the lake. It's never dried out. I've watched. I'd like to go back to it. I begged Elton Pruitt to let us do a TAS field school here, but he wouldn't bend to that. But if we look at this site, the way this site was discovered is that some sherds from this spot were discovered in a gopher burrow, eroding out. And this is a Pecos Glaze 5 polychrome bowl. Excuse me, my ceramic analysis is not up to modern standards. I'm not a ceramicist. That's a photograph of a similar bowl that's in the museum at Pecos Pueblo. Today, they're, in my opinion, they're identical, or close to being identical. A little overexposed, but this was back when we used film to take photographs and you didn't take but one. But anyway, but that's what keyed us into this site being proto-historic. When we excavated the site, we excavated 4 blocks. They're shown here. Those around 300 square meters. These large blue dots are clay-lined parts. Wolf Gossett from Texas, University of Texas, did archaeomagnetic dating on those, and we got the results quite early, before the radiocarbon dates. And they showed early occupations. The red dots are post holes. The other things are different kinds of features, little storage features and stuff. And what we have here, these are different burn features, etc. And what we have here is we have 3 teepee rings. The rocks aren't shown in this, there were rocks scattered around it. They were about 15 to 20 centimeters below the surface, sitting on a little soil, and remarkably well preserved. You can see this was back in the day before total stations, so we've got a 4-poster transit, and we're using water levels to shoot elevations. The older guys are laughing, thinking, God almighty, I'm glad we don't have to do that anymore. It's a walk through the past. If you look at this photograph, it's the Sioux camp, and I don't know how well you see it, let's watch out here. There's a teepee there, and outside of the teepee are a whole series of branches and stuff that have been stuck in for making windbreaks and Ramada shelters and that kind of thing. So the idea that you have all these post holes around these teepee are quite likely. This is probably not a single occupation. We think they're probably multiple occupations. So you have overlapping patterns that are occurring here as well. But if you look at the art, sorry, I've got to hit myself here. If you look at the features, this is one of the clay-lined parts, and inside of the teepee structure was this feature here, this elongated feature here. But that is a horn core from a cow, not a longhorn cow. Longhorns hadn't been developed at this time. Okay? These were probably Mexican Criollo cattle, and what we think this was a stake that was used as a tie-down stake for a rope that held the teepees down. This is the only photograph I could find showing Native Americans of Cheyenne erecting the teepees. If you look next to this pole, there's a little bitty line there, and that's a rope. So the teepees just don't sit on the ground and last. You're out here in areas where there's massive amounts of wind, usually, especially in the summer. I directed 6 seasons of field schools on the Canadian River north of Amarillo. And every year, our camp was destroyed by high winds. And when I mean destroyed, I mean totally destroyed. The tent sellers in Amarillo made a field day off of this because we kept buying tents and new tents. I had one student who went through 3 tents in a single season. So, but what they have to tie these things down and hold down in the high winds. And in this case, they used the horn core from a cow. Doug brought this in to the lab, and Elton and I were already in the lab. And when he did, he said, "This is the weirdest kind of bison horn I've ever seen." And both Elton and I looked at it. It's not a bison horn. So we called Ernie Ledelius up, and he was at the VP lab at UT, and said, "Hey, you got a minute? We've got something we want you to look at." And we take it over there. It's all encased in the sediment there. And Ernie looks at it. I don't know if any of y'all know Ernie, but he's a kind of a taciturn Texan Swede. And he looked at it and said, "Wait a minute." And he left. And we're sitting there for over 30 minutes. And he finally comes back, and he's got a whole cart full of horns, of everything you can imagine. And he pulls it out, and he said, "Yep, that's a cow. That's what I thought." So I think our idea is accurate here. Unfortunately, it's not very well preserved, and we weren't, and I still think we're not going to be able to get a radiocarbon date off of this as well. If we look at the dates from the Longhorn site specifically, that Longhorn site also has a horse bone on it, and we want to try and get a direct date on that as well. But if you look at these are all charcoal dates, old beta dates, so there's large standard deviations. And if you just sum all these, the sum spans basically about 900 years. It's useless. So I started working on this, trying to figure out how can we refine this. And what I did is kind of develop a technique, and I don't know if other people use it or not. And I'm just saying it's a minimal occupation technique. With the radiocarbon dates, what's the fewest number of occupations I can identify by averaging the dates and combining the dates that statistically are valid in combination. And what I found is we had 2 dates at the bottom that were too old, 2 dates at the top that were too young, and then the other dates, 15 dates here, could all be averaged statistically. Okay, and when we 1645 to 1665, so 20-year period in the mid-1600s, and then 1782 to 1794. And you say, okay, well, what's the difference between that and what you just argued about with Taylor's work? The difference is the archaeology. There's lots of southwestern ceramics. There's Spanish trade materials that are there as well. This is the age estimate for the age of that Pecos glaze 5 polychrome bowl. And there are other southwestern ceramics here that have micaceous tempers in them. And we also have what are called Pecos cloud blower pipes. If you read the Pecos reports, they show these are evidence of plains interactions. If you read all the reports of the plains, they say this shows we have southwestern connections. So yeah, okay, I'll take both of those. But there is not a single shred of metal that's come off of this site, none, or any other artifacts that suggest that it's any other than that early time period. And again, we need to do more work here. We're going to try and date that horse bone if we can get a date out of it. But I'm convinced that the evidence leans toward a mid-17th century age for this site. And it fits the pattern here. So current, how did they acquire their horses? The current evidence for how they got them is all related, all restricted to the documentary evidence. We don't have any archaeological evidence that sheds light on that. But the documentary evidence is fairly clear. 16th century Spanish in the Southwest, there's not lots of, but there's multiple evidence of Native Americans killing horses, attacking the Spanish and killing the horses. There are a couple of famous events in that, the Coronado. There are many records in the 17th century of the Spanish raiding the communities there and getting horses. Finding archaeological evidence of that kind of event, I'm not sure what that would look like, but maybe there is. One of the leading people that's done research on this, and is quite old now, is an anthropologist by the name of Jack Forbes. And Jack Forbes was one of the very few Native American anthropologists in the 50s and the 60s, and looked at this in much detail. This is an article that he wrote. He wrote a book or two, and a lot of our reliance on the documentary evidence is based on his on his research as well. So a lot of good stuff there. One of the things that we pulled out of his work. This is a chart. The red chart here is the tree ring record for droughts. This is based on the North American Drought Atlas. And then the top part there is the sequence. And what you can see is 1540s, Coronado and others come into the Southwest. There's a gap there of about 40 years. And then other explorers come in from Mexico into the Southwest. Eventually, Oñate, which is right about here, establishes the colony of New Mexico. And it's not a huge thing, but there's a permanent settlement there after that point. And as soon, almost, not instantly, but soon after Oñate gets there, he establishes different kinds of systems where they're forcing Native Americans to work, either through slavery or just encomiendos or other things. And as soon as that happens, then you start seeing evidence of raiding in the records here. And that escalates as their intensity of forced labor increases here, and all through the 1600s, so you see this. The point I want to make here is this first red dot here is the date of the Pueblo Revolt. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is clearly happening before that. And then this date here is the first presence of Comanches in the historical records that I've been able to find, 1706. And so Comanches may have been there earlier, but not very much, and they don't show up in the records. And so most of what we're looking at here cannot be attributed to Comanches in the Southern Plains. This is pre-Comanches, and there's a lot of things written on the Comanches. Luckily, we were able to exclude them, so that saves me reading about 25 or 30 books and everything else. But that's the point is that these are not Comanches. Are other groups that came in later, Sioux, Cheyenne, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get to that here in a second. So if you look at where the Native Americans got their horses, and this is, I'm going to go back to this. There's settlements and missions, et cetera, in the Southwest. There's the same thing in Mexico. I'll come back to this. And there are also mines in Mexico. And there are a lot of different ways that horses could have gotten there. One of the big factors here was when the Spanish started mining silver in Mexico. And there are a series of mines. They forced labor. They captured Indians. They were slave raiding in the north. They were grabbing these guys and bringing them down, women and children. They were pretty bloody ruthless, to be honest with you. And this created a lot of the problems here. You can trace the effects of this in Mexico by looking in this area. This is the area of Chichimeca. And as these missions, these are the mines, these silver dots here, as those mines were being established, and they were forcing the Native Americans to work in the mines, you then had a series of wars and skirmishes that were occurring that spanned from the period from 1550 to 1590. And the core part of this is the War of Fire and Blood, the Chichimeca Wars from the 1570s to 1585. It started scaling down after 85. But one of the interesting things here is the Chichimeca warriors were mounted. They were on horses, they were riding horses, they were attacking the Spanish and guerrilla warfare kind of tactics. And so the idea of Native Americans riding horses goes back to the mid-1500s there. The other factor that comes into play here, let's see, do I have that? Yeah, let's do it this way. The other thing that comes into play here is you get missions being established in the 1500s here, going all the way up to the Parral. But you also have slave raiding going from Parral, going up the Conchos River, especially to the Laguna de los Rios area, which is where Presidio is. And they were actively raiding people for slaves, and forcing them to come back and work in their mines, probably on their ranches, and everything else. And so there's a lot of activity into that area before the 1600s. If we look at the situation in New Mexico, remember, Oñate establishes the colony in New Mexico in 1598. It has a rocky start. I've got to get over here and do some pointing here. In the late 1500s, you had two missions established, one in Oquehuique and the other in Pecos. You then, in the next decade, you had missions established down here. This is this kind of milky green kind of color here, just what it looks like on this one. Then you had missions, more missions established, mainly at Pueblos, where these turquoise are, and then later on in other areas. And so you had an explosion of missions being established in this, and we have good records on the dates, so we can actually plot these out. So you can see how this kind of expanded and grew. And they're not far from the plains. And we know that the Plains Indians were the work of all sorts of people. And we know that they were going to the Pueblos and trading from before the Spanish times on. So there was interactions there. We also have the work of Eleanor Barrett, who is a geographer who was at New Mexico, University of New Mexico. And she was interested in the Spanish communities that were in this area. And she plotted out in the pre-Pueblo Revolt days, she plotted out 105 Spanish communities that existed in these areas. And the pattern is interesting. So there were a number of communities in this area. This is where Okeweke is. And what they did is they were on the Rio Grande, and they went up this valley, Mesa Valley, that leads to Chimayo. It was called La Canada. There are also a large number of Spanish communities on this stream, which is the Santa Fe River stream, or creek, I'm not sure where that is. And then you see a lot coming down the Rio Grande. And the Spanish, I think much to their consternation, were not allowed to take land from the Pueblo Indians. They were told that's forbidden. You can't take that land. So they had to go to areas where the Pueblos weren't farming. And by doing that, La Canada was not terribly intensively occupied by Native Americans, and the Santa Fe River was as well. So that's why you get those concentrations. And later in time, you see there's communities here, the San Basins here, the Salt Lakes here, that maybe they were going after. And then scattered communities and a concentration up in the Taos area. I didn't find any around Picaris, but I'm not sure. Are there? Yeah. Pre-Pueblo Revolt? Okay, good. We'll add those to the... Anyway, so what you see here, each one of these locations, and these would have been small farming complexes, and the missions were not large, but each one of these would have had at least a couple of domestic animals. And we're assuming that if they had access to cattle, they probably had accesses to horses as well. So we're using both of those as markers. And what we can see here is that there are 25 pre-Pueblo Revolt missions that were established, and about 105 or more Spanish communities. So there's a lot of places for raiding and for gathering stock. It is a treasure trove in terms of access to stock. So if you look at the patterns, and we have the missions in Mexico are not broken down so finely. The open circles are the 16th century, the red circles are the 17th century, and you can see even in this area in Texas, here of course going up to La Junta, going across into the Trans-Pecos, but also coming in from New Mexico. There's a lot of avenues that stock could have come into the plains, a lot of those, and at different time periods, going back as early perhaps as the mid-1500s. There's no evidence of that, but the possibility still exists there. So it gives you another kind of view for how this might have happened. And if you link that back to the work that's been done, the dating that's been done at Lubbock Lake and at the Longhorn site, some of these sources are certainly likely. And so one of the questions is where did the horses come from? Did they come from the southwest? Were they raised there? Were they coming from northern Mexico, from central Mexico? Were there horses that escaped all these horses and ended up in southern plains as wild Mustang herds? We don't know. We're hoping with the horse bones we have to do stable isotope analysis, especially strontium analysis, to see if we can reconstruct this, trying to create an isoscape of the southern plains in the southwest. There are bits and pieces that have been done. Taylor did this for a small area and with good results, and so we think this would be an exciting thing. It may be a while before that happens, but there'd be a lot of analysis associated with that, and it seems like in the recent time period finding funding for that is going to be a little more difficult, but there's always hope. You have to be optimistic here. So one of the questions that plays into this, when we talk about who were these people, and there's been research on this. Judith Habas-Mosh believes that the two of the groups that were identified by Coronado, the Carechos and the Tejas, that she can relate to these archaeological complexes. And so she equates the Carechos to the Tirablanca complex, the Tejas to the Garza complex, and it makes a nice, neat little package. But it's all dependent on where these groups were and where they're recorded by Coronado. And we don't fully know that, to be honest with you. So this is a guess on her part. She doesn't say that in the article, but it is a guess. I think, and I'll talk about it later, that, is that how this Mosh? Yeah, I think that their locations are different. Her locations, like I showed, show the Tejas south and the Connexions north. I think that she had those misplaced, and the Tejas are both north and south, but east, and the Derechos are further to the west, based on, and we'll talk about why I think this. There are some of these groups drop out. The Derechos show up in later documents, and they're further to the west. My question is did they become the Jicarilla Apaches? Did they become the Navajo? There's a lot of possibilities there that we're a long way from sorting out. We need a good anthropologist to get in there and do some detailed ethnohistory on this. But a lot of this does depend on where Coronado worked. And so as a spin-off project, I've been messing around with Coronado. This started when I got asked to write an article for Alan Skinner's Fischerschrift volume a couple of years ago, and I said, damn, I got to do something. And it wouldn't make any sense to do something in Africa, so I've got to find something in North America. So anyway, so I started playing around with this. And we're an advantage now with looking at these records because of all the new technology that we have. GIS, all the imagery that's available is really stunning. You can do a lot more than you could ever do before. And there's a lot of information. So Coronado, just to summarize this or recap this, 1540 to 1542, goes out into the plains. He was kind of led out there by Fray Marcos de Necia, claiming that there was huge wealth out in the southwest of the plains. Initially, they were going to Cibola. They go to Cibola. This was supposed to be a city of gold, and it actually was mud. You know, it's just why you want to have a good interpreter, I think, which they didn't have. And he had a large group, and there's different estimates for this. This is a high estimate, but it's estimated that Coronado could have had up to 3,000 people. This is a large community. 1,500 horses and mules, maybe as many as 2,000 cattle. I think that's high, but probably in the neighborhood of 5,000 sheep and pigs. And they went out from central Mexico up all the way into the southern plains. This is like moving, not a small community, but a big community. And think of the logistics for that. It would have been a nightmare. I wouldn't want to do it. If I had a field school that big, I would have thrown my hands up and quit. But anyway, so when they got to Oahu, which was Cibolo, there was no really well there. It was just adobe structures as we know now to be. And then when he traced out what he did is he went there, and then he went into the Rio Grande Valley. I'm just showing you a schematic map here. He went into the Rio Grande Valley, then to Pecos Pueblo, and then we know that he went to Blanco Canyon here, and that was one of his camp spots here. The other one we're not sure about. And then we know that he went to Primero. Waldo Weddle, over many years, made arguments and had evidence for him being at a series of what we think are Wichita sites in central Kansas. And so there's some known locations here that we can trace out. The question is can we fill this out and make more sense out of it? So anyway, I think I've already said this. Well, one of the things is that when he was in the Rio Grande Pueblos, he took on a guide that they nicknamed El Turco, who I think was a Wichita, and by then the Spanish abusing the Native Americans is fairly obvious at that stage of the game, and they decided that they were going to go out and find this new city of riches that they were calling Rivera, and this scheme was hatched by El Turco and some of the Native Americans from Pecos that happened to be in the Rio Grande Valley at the time, some of their leaders here. And so they start to go after this new location. There's lots of debates about how they got there. This is a reconstruction, a couple of reconstructions of some ways that they got there. They left Pecos Pueblo, and they got to the Pecos River, how they got there. This is the least cost path analysis, which is a technique in GIS that you can use. And if you just put in all the data there, they have them going in and out of the Pecos River Valley, which is not reasonable. It's a very rough valley. Think about how many people they had. This has them going back and forth across the Pecos River. The Pecos River is in flood, so when they got down to the far eastern side, it took them 4 days to build a bridge so they could cross the Pecos River. So going back and forth does not make sense. There's some historians, the Flints, who have this pathway as what they think is a logical pathway. But this is the one that I reconstructed using GIS, and I think it's more accurate. It's following the upper rim of the Glorieta Mesa, and I've looked in the records. There's no Spanish artifacts there that anybody's recorded, but it would be interesting to see if that shows up. They get out into the plains. They've had a reduction in numbers, but there's at least about 358 Spaniards, at least 2,000 Indio Amigos. They're the Central Mexican Native Americans that went with them, the majority of this population. Over 1,000 horses or so, 600 mules, at least about 560 cattle, and a large number of sheep, goats, and pigs. And the estimates that I developed from this, and we went back to farming and ranching evidence, is they would need somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 gallons of water a day. Now, I don't know how many of you have driven across West Texas and the plains, but finding 17,000 gallons of water is not going to be an easy matter. And they struggled for sure. One of the things that they had in their advantage, I don't know if this is going to show or not. Let's see, maybe we'll run it from this. Yeah, there we go. Is I use the tree ring records. Just going to go. Yeah, here we go. You started in 1838. You use the tree ring records from the North American Drought Atlas, and you can see it's dry. But by 1839 and 1840, it's wet. 1841, which is coming up, is also wet. And then in 1842, it dries out. So Coronado couldn't have, sorry?
1542.
Sorry, what did I say?
18.
Oh, sorry, 1542. Yeah, I'm sorry. So in the 1540s, Coronado couldn't have timed his expedition any better. He got there on the third year of a wet phase, and you're going across the plains, and there's almost no running streams out there. It's mainly playas, and it's remarkable how much water those playas will hold. Last year in May, I drove from White Flat, Texas, which is on the eastern side of the Llano Estacado, to Portales and then back in a day. And we drove over, and you've seen hundreds of playas. They were all dry. We followed not a huge rainstorm, but a rainstorm going back to the east, and all the playas had standing water in them in a matter of an hour or two. And so if you're there in a wet year and you time it right, you lucked out. And I think that's what happened. I think that they were lucky, and that there was available water, not a huge amount, because they complain about the water, but they certainly, if they'd gone the year after, I think we'd be looking for their bones out there. They wouldn't have made it. We can see there. But anyway, and the Spanish keep coming up with these events where they just luck out. It's just pure luck. They had no idea why these things are happening and that they happen, but they happen in their favor time and time and time again. And this is another example of that. Okay, now why is this there? Oh, this is the same slide. Okay. One of the questions I had when I got into this is just how accurate were the measurements in terms of distance and time, and et cetera. And so one of the famous records is a document called the Relación de Suso, and the author, who we don't know who it is, states, he says, we started, and he doesn't say from Pecos, that's me, with the whole army, proceeded 150 leagues, 100 to the east and 50 to the south. Okay. Everyone has assumed that he was measuring this from the Rio Grande Pueblos. But for me, if you're going to start out into the plains, you're going to measure it from the last pueblo you're at. So I measured this out just on Google Earth, measured it out from Pecos. And when you plot this out from Pecos, well, this is where it ends up if you plot it out from the Rio Grande Pueblos. It's somewhere in this amorphous landscape southwest of Lubbock. If you plot it out from Pecos, you end up in the mouth of Blanco Canyon. And the mouth of Blanco Canyon has a campsite that we know was Coronado. Coronado was the last expedition to have crossbows. In fact, it was the first and the last expedition to the plains to have crossbows. And if you find crossbow paraphernalia, then you know that you're dealing with one of his sites. And there's a site in Blanco Canyon called the Jimmy Owens site, where they found quite a few copper crossbow tips and other artifacts that date to the same time period. Horseshoes, nails, carrot-top nails, etc., etc. And there's little question about whether Coronado was there. And this measurement tells me that actually these measurements are surprisingly accurate. You have to be careful when you're going through this, because some of the measurements are made by people that are with the larger expedition, and some of them are with these scouting groups that are going out, usually in horses. So their speeds are different. The amount they can cover in a day are different. So what I did is I focused on the guy, Castaneda, that was with the major expedition and used those records and got fairly consistent, I think, results. We're going to find out here. So I've replotted and done least cost path analysis on all this stuff, and I'll come back to this. But you can see kind of where I'm seeing here. So one of the things that we were looking at is getting to the Coronado Bridge, which I showed you before, is pretty straightforward here, okay? But we know that after they left the bridge, they traveled for 12 days and came to the first canyon, Barranca campsite. And that was, I think, in Blanco Canyon. And we know that before they got there, they were at a Native American campsite, and it took them 4 days to get there. So what I calculated, I calculated from the bridge out for what I think is 12 days distance, and then from the Coronado campsite in Blanco Canyon, I calculated out using two different distances. And so this overlap there is where I think they were likely to be. And about 5 years ago, totally unrelated to any of this research, I wasn't looking at Coronado anything back then, but I was in communication with a collector. There are a lot of collectors out there. And he sent me a location of where he found a copper crossbow tip. And where that is on the upper end of running water draw. And running water draw is the drainage that creates Blanco Canyon. And we know that it took them 4 days to get there. That shows that if this is where Coronado was at that Coronado campsite, it shows that they ended up, and what they did is they just followed running water draw down there. Remember, this is before they had any significant rain, so they're hard up for water, and it's most likely that what you do if you're hard up for water, you don't start walking across the country. You follow the creeks. You go where you think you can find water, at least, and we think that that's where they ended up. And we can't confirm that, but we need more work there, and I'm working with some avocations to look at this. So when they got to the canyon, it was described as similar to those of Colima. And this is a photograph of one of the canyons in Colima, Mexico, western Mexico. And what you see is they're modest-sized canyons. You have a fair amount of depth to them. They've eroded this flat plains, which looks like the plains. And then that's a photograph of Blanco Canyon, and this is just an artistic reconstruction of what this may have looked like there. And while they were in the canyon, they got hit by a storm. And what we can see here is that in that storm, we said a whirling storm arose with the strongest of winds and hail, and it destroyed all their pottery, destroyed a lot of their tents, and they had a difficult time of that. This just shows you the estimate I have, and where they were during this leg of the trip, we don't know, because they didn't do a straight line path. It wasn't a straight line path at all. They wandered around. This is when El Turco was trying to get them lost, to kill them, and so he wasn't going to take them where you think. But I think the other pathway is likely good. So from here, where is the second Barranca that they camped at? There was a second Barranca that they described, and they set out to explore the country. They found another large settlement. It was in a canyon, 4 days from there, and then they walked up the canyon for 3 days. And if you plot out from the Jimmy Owens site, you plot out where 4 days traveled is, you come to here. And one of these spots is at the mouth of Palo Canyon. If you plot from there and go 3 days, you end up in the lower part of Palo State Park. And I think that's where the second Barranca is. We haven't found it yet. We're actually going to go back next month. We've got a grant to go back next month and search for it. I'll let you know if that happens. So we'll give another talk. And this is a photograph. We were there in May. This is a photograph looking from Mesquite Mesa down to that part of the canyon. It's a spectacular view, to be honest with you. It's going to be a challenge to work there, but it'll be a great project here. So from the Jerry Owens site, and I did the least cost analysis here. We come up here for 4 days, 3 days we come there. When they were in that canyon, Coronado decided to split the group. He goes north, and then he tells the guys regroup and resupply, and then go back to Pecos. Okay, and there's been a lot of debate about how they went back to Pecos. This is all that's in there. And Conquistadors says the army left the ravine and turned to the Tejas. And everyone says, well, what does that mean? They were already with the Tejas. Some people think that they moved down to the mouth. I think they returned back to Blanco Canyon. That's where they went. Is my take on that. And so that has to reconstruct the pathway back. And then while they're doing that, Coronado goes all the way to Clavera and stays here and does his usual show up in Clavera. We're not interested in Wichita just yet, so and other people are working on that. So, but then what they say is they return to the Tejas, and they took guys and led them back by a more direct road, and this way they covered 25 days and it would have taken them 37 days, and they found many salt lakes on this road. And if you plot the large salt lakes that occur in some of the plains, this pathway, which didn't use the salt lakes, goes through 4 of the salt lakes. This is Arch Lake, which is a substantial lake, and they describe it to a T. And so my guess is they went back there. They say that they hit the Pecos River about 80 kilometers south of where the bridge was, and then from there they go north from the bridge, and they return, and then Coronado comes back. Now, as a lark, the least cost path analysis work took days. I had a little computer, just sat there and cranked, and it took days, and I had to break it up into segments. So as a lark, I took all those locations and I put them into my iPhone and Google Maps. In about 2 seconds, it spewed this out, and it's pretty goddamn close. I was stunned. I was like, really? 2 seconds? And I spent days of trying to do this. And so, we'll be doing all this on phones in a couple more weeks, I think. But the pathway, and it goes all the way from really down Mexico all the way up here, and the whole 9 yards. So anyway, it was a shock because I put it in and I figured, well, it's going to take 30 minutes, and then it was there. Anyway, so even though Coronado made it across the plains and back to Mexico, the expedition was considered a failure. Okay, and the answer for why this is a failure is suggested in a skit from an old Andy Griffith show. And it's important to realize that this was that the trip to Clavera was planned from the Rio Grande. Hang on here. See if I can. Does this have the volume? Is there a volume switch on this? I forgot to check that out.
The remote, yeah.
Is there another?
There's a remote under there.
Does this have
Just next to the speaker.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Give her a shot. Let's see what we get. Yeah, yes.
Yes. It's just all.
They're not crooks. They just told me the reason they grabbed you is about to give away their plane.
But the truck!
The truck was nothing but a decoy.
A decal. None.
That's all it was.
You mean there was never any gold in that truck?
No.
A decal. Shazam.
They said that was their plan. To let folks think that was the truck with the gold in it, while the real truck went by a different route. Decoy. Shazam.
I think there's another. So, if the truck was first Cibolo in Clavera, and Barney's Coronado, which makes sense, and Governor's Frey Marquez Lisa, Andy must be on Turco. But why did they fail? They failed for fairly straightforward reasons. One is gullibility. Okay, they just listen to what The other is, and not a small dose of this, is just overwhelming greed. These guys were just pathetic. And ignorance, cultural conceit, that they were always had to be right, you know, and incompetence, and all those things go together. This is just,
That's familiar from today.
as I was listening to Morning Joe this morning to create a shit show. I mean, it was really bad. So the final analysis, the Native Americans faced with an almost impossible situation. I mean, it really was. They were just overwhelmed with this. But they outsmarted the Spanish, at least for a while, by creating a decoy. And El Turco was a big part of that plan. But my argument is that if El Turco and the Pueblo Indians had known about the rain in the plains that year, might have come up with a different plan and we'd be having a different story. Anyway, thank you very much.
Questions for Britt? Let me start with one. Once they get the horses, how rapidly do they diffuse that amongst these tribal groups?
I think they diffuse very quickly. I don't have any evidence, hard evidence for that. We're just trying to find the first evidence for the having horses. So how rapidly they diffuse? A lot of the historic records can be used on that. But there's no doubt that the Pueblo Revolt was a huge injection. And so after that, that's probably when they got to the Northern Plains, I guess. There are arguments that the Northern Plains had horses first and then they came south. I don't buy that. I think they came up from the south and went north. And I think that they're looking at one of the really neat studies on this is a study by Chad Oliver. I don't know if y'all have ever read his stuff, but he looks at the ethnogenesis of Plains Indian horse cultures in the plains and how complex it was, and how the Native American groups were molding themselves into a new formation, a new cultural identity, a new existence, and it affected everything. It affected settlement, kinship, warfare, economy, of course, religion in a big way. So that's why I think, that's one of the reasons why I think that Black's Fork is late, because for those things to happen, for horses were often considered later on as large dogs, okay, and for the connection between dogs and canines and horses to happen, that was a later thing. That wasn't in the 1600s. I don't think, and the question is who were these people? I think that people in the Southern Plains were probably Apachean speakers, Athabascan speakers, my guess is. The Himanos, that's another problem altogether, and they're separate in their ideologies. Anyway, more than you want to know.
How optimistic are you that you're going to find?
100%.
That was easy.
Other questions?
I'm very sure that somewhere in that canyon was Coronado's campsite. Whether we have permission to work on the state park property, and they added about 20 years ago. They added a huge section that's not open to the public, and they've done no work down there at all, no archaeology hardly at all. Ron Ralph went down and recorded a site or two in the 80s, and there's been no systematic survey, no shovel testing or any of that kind of stuff. So we're going to go in with metal detectors, working with avocationalists and the THC stewards and folks, and just see if we can turn up any metal down there. But it is the problem with this, and this is something we're trying to avoid, is the western area that we're interested in is the battle site for the Paladura Canyon battle between Mackenzie and the Comanches and the Cheyennes, and there's a lot of stuff there. So we're trying to avoid that. It's not that that's not interesting, but we're not at a point to where we're ready to deal with that. That requires integrating much more carefully with the Native Americans. We have contacted the Mescalero Apaches to see if they would work with us on this. We haven't heard back from them.
How many square miles are you going to have to cover?
Pardon?
How many square miles are you going to have to cover?
It's not as much as you think it is.
Oh, okay.
It's not as much. It's because we reduced it down to where we're just looking at the terrace deposits. If there's stuff up on the slopes, then it's going to be visible. And we're going to go fast. We're only going to be in there for 2 weeks. But but if we find something, we only have to find one thing. If we find something, we're already talking about doing a bigger project. But the Parks Department has done nothing. There's no archaeology at all done there. And they don't let the public in there. And they hardly get in there. We were talking to one of the Parks guys who's been there for 20 years, and he said, yeah, I've been down there a couple of times. Nobody goes down there. It's the ranchers, nearby ranchers lease it for grazing, so it's still used that way. But they won't let us on their roads. So we're trying to trying to work out access right now. So, anyway, but 100%.
All right. Well, if no more
Okay.
questions, thanks again.
Thank you.